So we're here at Moon's Rare Books, and we have with us Reid Moon, who owns a lot of interesting artifacts related to the history of the church, especially the development of the Doctrine and Covenants. And Reid has agreed to talk with us a little bit about some of the things that he owns that relate directly to the way the Doctrine and Covenants was produced and put together. So Reid, show us some of what you have, and let's talk a little bit about it.
Sure, I'd be happy to.
And just so we give you a little historical background here, this revelation is received during the translation process of the Book of Mormon. Joseph Smith is living in Harmony, Pennsylvania, which is about 125 miles away from where his family lives in Palmyra, but it seems like his family was anxious to check in on him and see how things were going. In particular, there were two brothers in the Smith family that seemed like they were keenly involved, and that's Hiram and Samuel. So this is sparked when first Samuel comes down in May of 1829. This is shortly after John the Baptist visits Joseph and Oliver and bestows the Aaronic priesthood upon them. Joseph notes in his history that a few days after Samuel visited, Hiram comes to visit. And it was common for Smith family members to ask Joseph to receive a revelation on their behalf. And that's the revelation that you've got a copy of right here.
Yes. As I come across these artifacts, I often kind of play out the scene in my head. And so you have the older brother, he's back taking care of the parents. And then it's been 9 years since the first vision, and everybody's excited. And then I have to think somehow Hiram got word. It's like, wait, Samuel, you've already been baptized. What about me? I want to be a part of this. And so he's so anxious. And so he goes back to Joseph, and he's so anxious to get involved, but Joseph knows he's not ready. And he receives the revelation for Hiram. And it's one of the great revelations. It's a revelation that's really commonly quoted to missionaries. When I was a teacher at the MTC, a lot of times we'd quote this revelation because it is exactly that message. Hiram wants to get in there and start preaching, and the Lord basically tells him, you need to take this time to study. You need to reflect and get to know and build your own knowledge. And then when the time is right, I'll call upon you to do certain things. Well, and I believe, isn't it one of four that start a great and marvelous work is about to come forth among the children of men?
Yeah, in fact, this is kind of the first of several revelations running from about section 11 up to around section 16, where just individual people involved in the work, whether it's Hiram Smith or Joseph Knight or David Whitmer or Christian Whitmer, approach and ask Joseph to receive a revelation on their behalf. So this is a patriarchal blessing before there were patriarchal blessings. Before there's a church, really. Everybody wants to know what the will of the Lord is for them specifically, and this is how it comes to pass.
Well, and I think it's also nice to know that of the first 20 sections, 19 of the 20 were pre-1830.
That's right.
And so that gives you the background of what's going on. The Book of Mormon's being translations. It's in those early formative years.
So when the Doctrine and Covenants is put together, what happens is that typically there was a copy of the revelation written down, and then the church historian, John Whitmer, copied them into what were called the Manuscript revelation books. Those are then taken to a printer and used to produce, in 1833, the very first version of the Doctrine and Covenants, which is called the Book of Commandments. Now, this is a replica, correct?
It's a replica.
And then in 1835, the first book called the Doctrine and Covenants, which you have a copy of right here too.
This is a newly acquired one that I will be sending off to a book restoration expert to repair. But there were about 3,000 copies printed originally, but as fewer than 100 have survived, maybe as few as 50. This was a book that they used, they read, and so they were worn out. And that's very typical of what you would see. And it's printed in 1835 in Kirtland. And I think it's interesting, why the name change in 2 years? It's Book of Commandments, and now 2 years later, it's the Doctrine and Covenants. Mm-hmm. If we just look in the front, I think we can answer the question. You will see something new at the beginning. You have the lectures on faith, and it says Doctrine of the Church of the Latter-day Saints. And then if we go back a little bit, we will find it's in two parts. Part second.
Yep. Part second, covenants and commandments of the Lord. So you can see the two parts, doctrine, that's the lectures on faith, and the covenants and commandments of the Lord. Now you might be asking right now, where's the lectures on faith in our current doctrine and covenants? Well, in 1921, another scripture committee was called. This consisted of John A. Widsoe and James E. Talmage and Joseph Fielding Smith. And that committee decided that since the lectures on faith weren't necessarily revelations, that they would be removed from the Doctrine and Covenants, but there was still plenty of doctrine in the covenants, and so we hung on to the name Doctrine and Covenants. Now, what's been happening the last couple of years is that historians from the Joseph Smith papers have been seeking to find the earliest copy of every revelation that's been given. And Reid, tell us a little bit about why this document in front of us is really important when it comes to section 11.
Well, if you go back to 2009, when the Joseph Smith papers published the revelations, there is no section 11 published as far as an early copy of that. A few years later, this surfaced. This revelation had been with the descendants of Hiram Smith. And when I got access to it, I contacted the Joseph Smith papers and asked if they'd like to see it. And they had said, yes, we've only seen photocopies of it. And so I took it in, and they did, actually had it for probably 6 weeks, doing every imaginable test. They now have the technology to test things quite accurately. This got the approval as, yes, this is the earliest known copy of section 11. And we know from the handwriting samples that this is definitively Hiram Smith's own hand in writing this down. And I can only imagine how he would have felt, especially the part, "Thou art Hiram, my son," and just him writing this out.
So this might not be the copy that was used to create the Doctrine and Covenants, but you can see Hiram sitting there and saying, I can't wait for a Doctrine and Covenants. I've got to have a copy of this right now. So he sits down and in his own hand records the revelation that we now know as section 11 of the Doctrine and Covenants. That just shows how sacred and special these revelations were to the people that received them.
Well, and I think one reason it survived well, it was folded up and probably realistically put in a family Bible, because you can see that little segment right there, his age differently, that would have been against leather. But that also protected this document for over 190 years now.
And we should know that Hiram Smith goes on to be pretty important in the history of the church. He dies as a martyr alongside Joseph Smith in Carthage jail. And at one point in section 124 of the Doctrine and Covenants, Hiram is told that he's taking the place of Oliver Cowdery, who by then had been excommunicated from the church as the second witness of the restoration, that all the keys, powers, and gifts that had been given to Oliver Cowdery were then passed on to Hiram Smith. So this is really kind of the first place in the Doctrine and Covenants where Hiram Smith enters into the narrative and becomes part of a story that he's going to be with all the way up to the day that Joseph Smith dies, because it's the day that Hiram Smith dies as well.